got about an hour here. My name's Lucas Livingston. Hey, thanks for joining the Chicago Brewseum's virtual happy hour. This is our second of a series while we're all isolated under self-isolation and in quarantine here during the pandemic. It's a great way to connect and get out of that quarantine for a little socialization online here. And this is drinking culture in ancient China. So we're going to be having a lot of fun here going through. Actually, this is a virtual tour. I'm involved with the Chicago Brewseum on the board. I'm also, I work at the Art Institute of Chicago as a lecturer there and giving tours and such. My particular academic focus is on antiquities, and just over time, giving tours throughout the galleries. Something also, I'm gonna mute if you don't mind for a moment. Well, I don't know. Yeah, if you want to encourage, I want to encourage everybody who wants to maybe mute themselves. You can do that by I think in the whether it's in the upper left corner on your ribbon or in the bottom left corner, there's a little mute microphone there. You just click on that to mute yourselves. I could mute y'all, but also this will be experimental. I kind of want people to be able to unmute themselves, to chime in if you have questions and thoughts along the way. So I don't want to just go ahead and mute everybody. So I'm accustomed to giving tours in the galleries of the Art Institute and encouraging people to interrupt along the way and ask questions, make comments, thoughts, observations. So by all means, let's keep it that way. But if you're just listening, then just a courtesy, if you wouldn't mind thinking about muting yourself, that'd be fantastic. But so giving tours, looking at ancient Egyptian feasting scenes and ancient Chinese drinking vessels and Greek drinking parties, and people asking me, well, did the Egyptians malt their barley? I don't know. Let me look into that. Well, was ancient Greek wine spontaneously fermented, or did they inoculate it with yeast? I don't know. I'll look that up and let you know. So, do more digging and learning and figuring this all out. Discover, gosh, you can make this stuff at home. Gosh, I went down that rabbit hole fast. So anyway, the history and culture of beer and wine in antiquity is a particular focus of mine and has been for the past dozen or more years. And so I love to share that in a lot of my tours, and then great to have the opportunity through the Brewseum here. One thing, so during this period, so many of our arts and cultural organizations are reaching out to the general public with ways to engage online, engage through a lot of the existing resources that already are in place through the website and such. And one great resource that sometimes flies a little under the wire, or under the radar rather, is the Google Arts and Culture. And so some of us might be familiar with that. A lot of us certainly be familiar with with Google Streetview, being able to see, like, from a driver's perspective. So one fun thing, Google Streetview, if you come up to the Art Institute of Chicago, here we are. One nifty thing that you might not be entirely aware of is that you can, the little person down at the bottom, if you drag that little person over the map and you plop the person onto the galleries of the Art Institute, then all of a sudden here you find yourself inside the galleries of the Art Institute, being able to walk around, going around virtually as though you're inside the museum, clicking on certain treasures and getting to go in closer and read and look at nice close detailed images and such. You can sometimes zoom in really incredibly close there. So the Google Arts and Culture is a great resource to be able to get that virtual experience, that virtual walkthrough from home. We are not here to be looking at the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. However, we are here to explore the art of China, and especially drinking culture in ancient China. Beer and wine, or what was it that they were drinking back then, thousands of years ago. And we're going to be going across vast time and space here together, going back as far as, well, prehistory, the earliest evidence for fermented beverage in the history of the world. Well, it's a bit of a fight here, a bit of a race, but archaeological evidence keeps pushing it further and further back. But for a long time, it was for a while it was thought that going back about 7,000 BC in ancient China, some of the earliest evidence of of intentionally fermented beverages comes from the Jiahu region in ancient China. This interesting concoction of what they had available to them. That's the interesting thing. Different varieties of fermented beverages from around the world, and often making use in antiquity of whatever staple products they had available to them, whatever their local type of grain or sugar, whether it's fruit, of course, any of fermentable item. If it can ferment, then gosh darn it, humans at some point in time fermented it. So in ancient China, 7,000 to 6,800 BC. So that's, 9,000 years ago, they were fermenting some sort of a mixed alcoholic beverage with honey, with rice, the staple grain, a staple starch, with the ancient wild Chinese grapes, so not the Eurasian grape that 99% of wine today is made with, but an indigenous ancient Chinese wild grape. And some evidence of chrysanthemum flowers put in there. And so this interesting mixed fermented beverage, micro residue analysis tells us a little bit about that, trying to use some great science and chemistry to figure out what was actually in what are now these desiccated, dried remains caked on the walls of ceramics. This might ring a bell with some of us if we're at all into the craft beer scene, knowing what some interesting inventions that have been going on. Certainly a few years ago, Dogfish Head produced their Ancient Ales series there, and in conjunction with Dr. Pat McGovern out of University of Pennsylvania, sort of the Indiana Jones of ancient beer and wine. And they tried to recreate and resurrect these ancient styles. You might see up on my shelf thereabouts is a few bottles of some of that. If you can zoom into my picture, not the screen share, up above is a bottle of the Chateau Jiahu, now empty, of course, alas. But this recreation of that ancient Chinese beverage, and also next to that is Tahenket, their ancient Egyptian beverage. Here we are looking, though, on the screen share of a magnificent work from the Tang Dynasty, this monumental scale image of the seated Buddha in meditation. The Tang Dynasty, that's much, much later than what we're talking about. That's around 600 to 900 AD. We're going to definitely get as far as the Tang Dynasty, but first we're going to spin around and we're going to go into the ancient Bronze Age of China. Everybody's okay taking a few stairs up here. We're just going to go up these stairs down the hall. I'm always conscious of, somebody might prefer to take ramps or elevators, but I think we can all manage stairs here in this virtual tour. We're going down our galleries, beautiful jades from antiquity, going back to almost about 4,000 years to about 2,000 years, these jade carved figurines, and then make a left into our galleries of ancient, the ancient Bronze Age of China. I'm just going to bring up our chat window again here, just in case if there's anything fantastic that I'm missing in our our chat. But yeah, and again, if anybody has any thoughts or such along the way, don't hesitate to chime in, unmute yourself, and ask something or say something. I think somewhere kicking around, there's also a feature in Zoom that lets people raise their hands. That's maybe a bit of a better way to really grab my attention if there's any kind of a technical issue. So here we are now in ancient China. This is in the historic era, and going back to about around 1700 BC, the Shang dynasty, Shang, the Shang dynasty of China, and the Zhou dynasty, which starts around 1000 BC, I think around 1050 or so, and continues on till around about 200 or so BC, the Zhou dynasty. I mean, it's further subdivided between the Eastern Zhou and the Western Zhou. We're not going to get into all that. Zhou is spelled Z-H-O-U, but we pronounce it Zhou, just like, kind of like the name. These bronze vessels, so the Shang and Zhou dynasties are so renowned for their bronze objects, these magnificent scale objects with incredible artistry and detail. Just to give you a sense, so around 1700 to 1000 BC, across Asia, nothing of this quality, this artistry is being produced outside of China. So China really takes the cake in terms of bronze casting in antiquity. And we've got a number of great vessels here. Well, don't worry, we're going to get into some details like this great vessel here. If I can manage to get my controls out of the way, hiding over my. Sorry. Let's try this. Great. Okay, let's look into this tripod goblet. I created a bunch of links for myself that we're going to jump to over time. So this takes us to the Art Institute of Chicago's website, where everything that we're looking at through this virtual tour is presently on display at the Art Institute. I should say, when you're using that Google Street View to crawl through the museum galleries, that's a snapshot of how things looked back in 2012. But a lot of the galleries look still similar. There's been some radical changes, but I'm choosing only works that are presently on display, with one caveat at the end: a Japanese screen we're going to take a look at if we keep moving along here, Lucas. But this incredible, what are we calling it in the label? It's a goblet. Yeah, jia is the Chinese name for it. This magnificent vessel. We have another side view here. I like this view as well, which shows us a bit of the details from the side. So what's remarkable about these objects is every step closer we take, it reveals additional layers of detail. So down to almost the millimeter. Let me go back to the other picture. I think it's even higher resolution than the one we were looking at. Yeah, so you can see down almost to the millimeter scale. There's this great bovine type of ornament on the side of the vessel, but then you also have a lot of bronze cast details in there. We call this a goblet. So this large, it's about 2 feet high or so, vessel that stands on the tripod, this tripod pedestal. This is, I guess one might say, this is the growler from ancient China. This is the type of vessel you'd fill it from a larger quantity to take with you to somewhere for a gathering, for a party. And what are they filling it with? Well, we call these vessels so often, or what we call them, wine vessels. Now, when we say the word wine, we're thinking, okay, well, they're drinking grape wine. Well, no, not exactly. The term wine is tossed around, but more properly, it's a mixed fermented beverage. We already encountered that one from 7000 BC. Now we're around 2000 to 1000 BC, and it's a mixed beverage of rice and millet, according to the residue analysis, again from the remains of encrusted on the sides of these vessels. Residue analysis shows us that and so actually bring up some notes here to I've got on my screen to tell us more specifically what we might find. So it's a mixture of millet and rice. Millet is a type of ancient grain. It's similar to what you could get in the grocery store. Certainly you can get millet today. And they might have tossed all varieties of other different herbs and spices in them. Some types of tree resins even is something we find in antiquity, and even in the ancient Mediterranean world and ancient Greece. And today still you think, okay, tree resins in your fermented beverage, well, I don't know, that doesn't really strike my fancy. But you go to Greektown in Chicago and you can get yourself a glass of Retsina, this incredibly resonated wine. I mean, yeah, again, some people say it's an acquired taste, but I've managed to hone my palate enough to condition there to enjoy that. We would also find, yeah, chrysanthemum, peach, plum, varieties of fruits and such, jasmine, different herbs as well. It's even supposedly the analysis shows that Artemisia, some type of herb that's a relative of wormwood, would be found in the ancient drink of this time, this grain alcohol, which wormwood certainly, suggests having some psychotropic powers there. So to what extent, if we're drinking this, would it not only get us intoxicated, but maybe a little high as well? So then looking back at the virtual galleries here, we find oh, this was the one we were looking at. Sorry, not that. So this one here is that one there. We can zoom in a little closer and see that. We also have these lovely little serving vessel here. You imagine you might fill that up with a bit of the wine and serve it at your feasts. And what are the feasts that they're having here? Actually, we can look a little closer. That's not the one, is it? It's this one here. It's a lovely little vessel. So the feasts that they're enjoying at this time, the function of these vessels, they're largely found in a funerary context. That's why they survive, so as grave goods. But then they were crafted for use in daily life, not strictly speaking daily life, I wouldn't put it that way, but more in ritual function. These bronze vessels are for the elite of society, the nobility and the aristocracy, so the real upper crust 1% of ancient China at this time. And their funerary feasts upon the deceased. This is well before the advent of Buddhism in China, and Buddhism anywhere in the world. So the ancient religion of this time in China involved these elaborate funerary celebrations, funerary feasts, and daily life celebrations, but especially involved in the funerary feasts where a descendant of the deceased is determined to be almost like a medium through which they will channel one's ancestral spirits at these epic funerary feasts. That individual's called the Shi, S-H-I, this descendant imbued with the power to channel the spirits, and everyone would partake in offerings at the feast, these large vessels for serving and distributing the beverages. And then we also have a variety of different containers for meats as well, cooking. So the sweet vapors rising to one's ancestral spirits, and the alcohol being poured in libation, as well as drunk copiously. The Shi, this medium, is said to have drunk 9 of these beakers. This slender beaker here we have, this beaker, it's called a gu. So we have a slim, slender beaker here, which probably wouldn't contain too terribly much alcohol in it, but we also have some that are much wider and could certainly hold a fair amount more. These are the goblets. These are the drinking mugs from ancient China, beautifully crafted, beautifully rendered. So drinking up to 9 of these beakers full of their alcoholic beverage. Certainly after about 9 of these, you will definitely be channeling some ancestral spirits one way or another. Let me close these out here. So there's incredible, incredible vessels with beautiful details on them. There are a lot of recurring motifs that we find on these. Let me go to, yeah, this one here. There's a lot of recurring motifs across centuries, and so some repeated shapes, which is really interesting to see that we have many shapes that find themselves repeated time and time again, showing us that there's this strong centralized authority in China at this time, this imperial Shang court that is commissioning and dictating the production of these vessels. We don't see a lot of regional variance or room for artistic experimentation quite yet at this time. One recurring motif we see on this beautiful vessel here, you can see almost like this incredible mask, totally like some Decepticon Transformer symbol here, with these raised bosses. Looks like the eyes of a beast, and swirling horns up above and snarling tusks down below. This form we see repeated over and over on these bronze vessels, whether they're large or small, sometimes more pronounced, sometimes much smaller and harder to figure out. This we refer to as a taotie, T-A-O-T-I-E. That is a much later term that came about to describe this emblem. What it was referred to back in the Shang Dynasty, we don't exactly know, but we do think that this figure, this recurring motif, has evolved over time, appearing again, and ultimately relieving itself from the walls of these vessels and becoming its own emblem, and thinking it morphs gradually in time into much more popular symbols of Chinese art and legend and lore, like dragons and ogres. This is a primitive version of the ogre or the dragon, one might think. Another recurring motif, I don't know how well we can make it out on here, we can just barely see, is, well, not so much easily there. It is there. This is a lot easier to see right here. You see these two googly eyes right there, and then this sort of triangular chevron body. That is a very highly stylized cicada insect. The cicadas, so we're so used to our cicadas around in this part of the country. Every, like, whatever, 15, 13, 17 years, you get this cacophony of cicadas. But annual cicadas that come every year in August and such are across the world. And in antiquity, they were celebrated in China as emblems of longevity, of immortality, of continuity across the generations. So something very befitting for a funerary object. So going back to our macro view of the galleries here, and there's a lot of speculation on the origin of wine. Even in ancient China, we looked at already discussed the archaeological evidence, but even in ancient times, they were wondering, where did wine, and again, I use the word wine, but really I'm talking about a fermented grain alcohol, millet and rice fermented as the staple. We'll get into what it tasted like and how it was fermented in a quick sec, but all the way as far back as the 2nd century of the Common Era, we find a text that's inquiring or just exploring the origins of wine. It says that the origin of wine began with the ancient kings. Some say it was made by this king, this or that. I can't pronounce the name, E.T. or something like that. And others say it was made by Tu Kang. But in fact, it began when discarded rice was fermented, and it accumulated a rich fragrance after a long period of time in a trunk. It was because of this, rather than any secret method, that wine was produced. That was in the 2nd century, and in the 11th century of the Common Era, we get another text called the Treatise on Wine. And it kind of cuts more to the chase, simply admitting that as for who was the first who invented wine, I can only say that it was a certain wise person. Now, but yeah, what did it taste like? And how did they make it? So, you think, okay, when we make beer out of barley or whatever other type of a grain alcohol, we first have to malt the barley and make this mash from that. And that activates enzymes, turning the starches into sugars. We're not going to get too thick into those weeds. And there's a few people on the call who can explain it far better than I. But with millet and rice, did they malt? those grains, or actually another popular method for activating the enzymes that convert starch into sugar that we find still happening in regions around the world. There's still some very traditional methods of brewing in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, and some very traditional methods happening in the Andean region and Peru and such. And that involves something called mastication. Don't worry, mastication is not a dirty word. We can say that. Mastication is just chewing. So taking these grains, chewing on them. You might cook them a little bit first so you're not breaking your teeth. Chew on them, and it's our own saliva. It has these enzymes in that will kickstart that conversion from starch into sugar. I mean, it sounds disgusting that we're basically drinking other people's spit, but we must bear in mind that even a moderate level of alcohol, 2-3%, is sufficient to kill most harmful bacteria that and such that we might have in our own mouths. So, but yeah, what it tasted like, that's really where we have to open it up to experimentation. And yeah, certainly Dogfish Head and others have taken their stab at trying to recreate and resurrect these beverages. To toot my own horn here. My own hobby of home brewing here has led me down that path as well, creating an ancient Chinese beer. This Morgue Brewing, purely my own personal vanity homebrew, but we got this Chinese moldy ale brazen spirits. You can visit ancientartpodcast.org/brew or morguebrewing.com if you're really interested, checking all that out, and you can follow my exploits, talking about the Taotie as beer gargoyles, serving this apotropaic function to ward off the evil spirits that would seek to invade and corrupt the tomb and damage the ritual feasts. So let's move along here, though. Gosh, we're only about halfway through our time, and we could go on forever, but we're not. We don't have time. Or is time what we all own, the only thing we have these days? We're going down the galleries. We're looking, oh, look, here's some ancient jade cicadas as well. We talked about cicadas. Fun fact, the two on the left, these are cicada insects. The two on the left here are from around the 2nd century or so of the Common Era, the Han Dynasty. The two on the right are actually 20th century. Would you call that a fake, or are they homages to antiquity? Making a corner here and heading into our gallery of the Tang Dynasty. Tang, T-A-N-G. This is around 600 to 900 AD. So we're well into, as far as I'm concerned, that's current events, modern times. And we have this magnificent camel. Sometimes when you're browsing through Streetview, you see these dots, and that takes you into the details here of the item, and you can view it in HD. I love this camel. This is a real highlight, a treasure in the collection. The Bactrian camel, 2-humped Bactrian camel, the semi-truck of the what's called the Silk Road. At this time, the Silk Road, this is the heyday of the Silk Road, this vast caravan of mercantile routes stretching across China, across Central Asia, going as far as the Mediterranean, and then the goods of the East make their way to as far back in time as the Roman emperors, and as far later in time as really all of medieval Europe and onward, and going eastward as far as Xi'an or Chang'an, then the capital of China during the Tang Dynasty. We can look at this beautiful camel, and here, let's zoom in, come on. The camel is this magnificent semi-truck of the Silk Road, as I said, with a beautiful glazing style. The Tang Dynasty is so known for this almost Jackson Pollock-like smattering of glaze trickling down the body of the camel here. This incredible application of a multicolor, referred to as 3-color glaze, actually 3-color glazing, sansai. So prominent creams, greenish colors and browns that we see. If we look really long and hard on some objects, we might find a few other colors. I love this saddlebag here, this ogreish saddlebag. This reminds me, is this the late stage evolution of that tautia we were looking at earlier? Is this modeled after the types of saddlebags that merchants of the Silk Road might have slung over their camels at this time? Or is this purely fantastical? Is this some invention by the artist purely for the context of this object? And we remind ourselves then, what was the context of this object? This is a grave good. Everything we find in this gallery of the Tang Dynasty, these are all funerary objects, all grave goods again. So they survive because they were interred with individuals in their burials for thousands of years. And so then does this saddle bag here, the tautia, the ogreish mask, serve also as this apotropaic device, so this ward against evil and incursion? These two horses are great. I love these horses too. This is somewhat like a reconstruction of a caravan route coming in off the dusty trails of the Silk Road. These horses are really interesting. Let's zoom in at them as well. And first looking at let's look at the white horse first. And we look at the details of the white horse, looking at the beautiful garland that it has here. This is pretty interesting. I've seen lots of examples of these ceramic horses in other collections and other museums around the world, looking online or in person. And usually these ornamental details on the harness or I'm sure there's a more proper word for this element of the horse tack, is usually has more square emblems that might be emblematic of bronze or some metallic jingle jangles and such, while the horse is trotting along, reflecting and jingling. These ones are a little more interesting though. Let's look closely at what we see. Yeah, what do these look like? I don't know about you, but I'm thinking these look like leaves. Not just any kind of leaves. We look also at the brown horse. Compare these two side by side, and we wonder, well, what are the? Okay, if those are leaves, and then here on the brown horse, we've got these clusters, not of leaves, but they look like these clusters of little bunches and dots. And it looks totally to me like these are clusters of grapes and grape leaves. And China in this time, in the Tang Dynasty, this is when grape wine is reintroduced to China. Not since circa 7000 BC did the Chinese drink copious amounts of grape wine, which they do now again, thanks to the mercantile exchange along the Silk Road. They're not using the wild grape as they were in prehistory, but now this is the Eurasian grape. And it's not grape wine produced in China, but it's produced in Central Asia, in the Fergana Valley region of China, in the areas of what's now modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and such. And so this, the Takamalakan desert region of China, going back centuries, both east and west, the recipients of this incredible beverage from Central Asia extolled the quality of the wine coming from this region of the world. The first century Roman historian Strabo, he wrote that this is a place where huge quantities of wine are produced from huge clusters of grapes. Wine that's so sublime that it doesn't even need to be resonated. I love that. Again, we go back to resonated wine, and this is in the Mediterranean. You think, okay, well, but you know what's Strabo saying? If you don't need to add resin to it, I don't know. That doesn't really speak much highly of ancient Roman wine. And then even later on, you find around in the Han or Tang Dynasty, there's an encyclopedia which refers to this part and the wine of this region of the world, saying that the Western regions, so here we're in China and Central Asia now is to the West, the Western regions possess a grape wine which is not spoiled by the accumulation of years. A popular tradition among them states that it is drinkable up to 10 years, but if you drink it then, you'll be drunk for the fullness of a month and only then be relieved of it. So maybe not such a bad idea to bide our time in quarantine here. Speaking of the exoticism of the far frontier to the west of Central Asia, as far as China pushes militarily expanding, trying to further reach and get a stronghold in the rich, fertile valleys of this region, where the wine basket, wine basket of the world. So in the 9th century, Chinese emperor, extolling the virtues of wine, says, "When I drink this, I'm instantly conscious of harmony, suffusing my 4 limbs. It is the pure princeling of tranquility." Let's take a look at some other objects. So, I mean, what I think with these horses is that these merchants of the Tang Dynasty here, of the Silk Road, are advertising. These are not beasts of burden, these horses. These horses are prestige steeds. They are commodities themselves. That you see, they have riding saddles. These are based upon the morphological characteristics of these ceramic horses. We can actually identify the breed as a horse that was praised from the Fergana region as well in ancient Central Asia, called the Fergana horses, or also sometimes called the blood-sweating horses. It's said when they were worked and rode to such a feverish fervor that they would actually sweat blood. I don't know, you might want to have that checked out. But much like we have, this is a bit of my own speculation, but much as we have taxis riding around the cities with placards on top, advertising whatever is happening in the cinema or on Chicago Broadway or such, different advertisements, so too I think the merchants are taking advantage of valuable real estate on the side of these horses, advertising the wine that they also have for sale in the cart that we don't see, cart off camera here. So yeah, this is really the heyday where wine, pardon the pun, makes a splash in China. But we see other interesting objects from the Tang Dynasty, in this case over here. Here's where we find some fun Google Street View fails, where this 2-handled amphora to the left here seems to have 3 handles. Let's take a better look at that amphora. We've got that right here, yeah. This is incredible amphora. This is interesting. So much of the ceramics of the Tang Dynasty suggests some influence of the Central Asian cultures of now what are at this time in China, contemporary to the Tang Dynasty, are the Sogdians, or even ancient to them, the Gandharans and Sasanians, all these regions of what were once ancient Persia, which after the fall of the Persian Empire fell under Hellenistic Greek rule after the conquest of Alexander the Great. And so for some centuries had a Grecian rule, but still a thriving, more indigenous culture underneath. And then eventually the Greeks were toppled, but they maintained this vestige in the elite material culture of some vestige of that Hellenistic Greek quality. And so this amphora, to use the ancient Greek word for a storage vessel, a container jar, or a wine jug, essentially, the beautiful dragon motif that we see at the top, these 2 dragons dipping their noses into, their snouts into the vessel, drinking from it. So it's a really incredible object. And again, the glazing quality, this dripping, cascading, melting glaze over the bodies is really something. We also have, these darling little dragon horns, basically, like we think of Viking drinking horns, but the drinking horn is a popular shape we find all across the Mediterranean, through Central Asia, and then on into China. I mean, just think of an ox or a cow's horn. It's the perfect vessel. You don't even have to work at it. You just take it off of your dead herd and your cattle after you slaughter them, and pardon that, and this is a vegetarian speaking, but anyway, and then you've got yourself this great vessel. I've got a detail of those two here from this one. Those objects you actually won't, you'll find them on display, but you won't find them on the Art Institute's website because they are objects on loan to the museum, and the museum only puts works that it owns on its website. But these incredible objects where you have the dragon head on one, and this almost like a what is this, a phoenix type of head on the other. Really great. We are quickly running out of time here, but just to wrap things up, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and conversation. Going a little further down the hall, we take a look at what's in this case here. Again, just more magnificent objects of the drinking culture in Tang Dynasty China. Very diminutive pieces, but we have this ladle, which is great and wonderful. We have a little drinking cup, and then we have this mirror. And those are details I wanted us to look at. So this drinking cup we all recognize from the title image for this talk. Let me open up the other two while we wait. The ladle and then the mirror. And so this stem cup here, it's very dainty. It's about the size of a just like a coffee cup or a tea cup. So this diminutive item. But let's look closely at the details. And again, here we see clusters of grapes and vine leaves amidst birds flitting about on the ladle as well. Not to belabor this point, but likewise we have the same vine motif as the birds are plucking at the grapes. And on this mirror, this is the back side of a mirror. The other side would have been much more smooth and polished to a sheen. Not quite a perfect mirror image, but enough to at least see as you're applying your cosmetics or fixing your hair. But again, we have the grape and vine motif with the bird flying about, plucking at those grapes. So really, really great fine details here. Just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, we've got some great texts from this era that tell us a bit about drinking. Drinking in ancient China was often equated with a heightened sense of creativity. They often go hand in hand, a minor intoxication together with inspiration for poetry and painting and artistic expression. So often we find the drinking and creativity going hand in hand. One of the greatest poets from ancient China, Li Bo, or Li Bai, as he's sometimes referred to as, is one also known as, a great poet, but also a great drinker, one of the 8 immortals of the wine cup. And he had a bit of a reputation for himself as a profound drinker. There was actually a member of the imperial court who once wrote of him that I have as my guest probably the greatest poet that has ever lived, but I dare not recommend him to your majesty because of his one flaw. He drinks, and often too much. Just as we have in the eras of, Victorian England and such, we've got these texts that are meant to tell us books of manners, so how to act in proper civil occasions and such. So too in ancient China, around this time, we have something referred to as the Donghuan Bureau of Etiquette, writing different communications of a complementary nature between fellow officials. This is from, actually dated to the year 856 AD. And within that text, there's a great letter. It's called an apology, a letter of apology for getting drunk. And it goes something like this. Yesterday, having drunk too much, I was so intoxicated as to pass all bounds, but none of the rude and coarse language used was uttered in a conscious state. The next morning, after hearing others speak on the subject, I realized what had happened, whereupon was overwhelmed with confusion, ready to sink into the earth with shame. and it was due to a vessel of small capacity, having been filled for the nonce too full. I humbly trust that you, in your wise benevolence, will not condemn me for my transgressions. Soon I will come to apologize in person, but meanwhile, I beg you to send this written communication for your kind inspection, leaving much unsaid. I am yours respectfully. So yeah, great times in ancient China. You can tell they certainly enjoyed getting their drink on. We have about 15 minutes left here in our fun. If anybody has any questions, or comments or thoughts, I welcome you to unmute yourself and chime in, or type it in the chat box. Yeah, we got a good amount of time for that. If we don't have any immediate questions, I'm certain I can also go back and revisit anything we might have looked at or covered. If we don't have any questions, then I got one last little thing I can share with us, a drinking game from ancient China, which actually will presage what we have coming up a week from tonight at this, same bat time, same drunk hour, is the drinking games in history. So the next event with the Brewseum, if you go to the website here, chicagobrewseum.org, click on events, you can scroll down, so drinking culture in ancient China, and then coming up next week is drinking games in history. So we're going to go back to ancient Greece. We're going to go into, we might touch on China if we don't cover the drinking game in our next few minutes, and then go into the medieval world and Renaissance as well. Yeah, so, all right, cool. I guess we got time then for the gathering at the Orchid Pavilion. And this is a great Japanese folding screen, actually. So it's Japanese, not Chinese. It's not presently on display, and the screens can only be displayed once every 5 years. Any work on paper, actually, once every 5 years for 3 months at a time. That's the rule of thumb in the Art Institute. This is Japanese. It dates to the year 1900 by Noguchi Shohin, a Chinese woman artist who she actually, incidentally, in 1893, she exhibited at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago and received a prize for painting in the exposition. Not for this particular screen, for a different painting that she did. But the gathering at the Orchid Pavilion harkens back to the Spring Purification Festival from the year 353 AD. And said in ancient China, a group of scholars and friends gathered together at the Orchid Pavilion in China for a day of poetry, writing, music, and wine drinking. And so around this time, 353, was it grape wine or was it some sort of a grain-based alcohol? The debate's still out on that. But so what's shown in the screen here are these scholars finding pleasant spots along the banks of a stream, sitting down, and servants upstream. I don't know how well we can see, zoom in here. So servants here are filling these dainty little cups of wine, floating them downstream on lotus blossoms and lotus petals, and the servants along the banks of the shore are pulling these cups into shore and giving them to the scholars. And it was something of a drinking game, actually, in ancient China at this gathering, where ostensibly as something of a punishment for composing your poetry too slowly, you had to drink more heavily. So this fun thing, again, tying together intoxication, inebriation with artistic creativity. Well, you're not writing your poetry fast enough? Well, drink more, that'll fix it. So a real fun time in ancient China. A bit of a preview of next week, our drinking games discussion.